Raised panels are a fundamental part of cabinets and furniture. If you're into woodworking, you'll eventually need to make them, and when you do, you're going to be bombarded with videos and articles that demonstrate all sorts of methods using tools you probably don't have, like a table saw with a dado set or a powerful router so you can spin these giant raised panel bits. But today I'm going to show you how to make raised panels quickly and easily with just a regular straight router bit. And we'll do this safely. No standing the panel on edge as you cut it or tipping it to impossible angles. Instead, we'll keep the panel flat and secure as we cut it with a simple homemade jig built with just a few scraps of plywood. I even made some plans so you can make the jig yourself. You'll find a link in the video description below, and I'll also pin it to the top of the comments section. Now let me show you how it works. First, you have to know a little bit about how raised panels are constructed. The panel sets in a groove in the frame around it. Since the frame is typically 3/4 of an inch thick, the raised panel would protrude far proud of the frame if it were also 3/4 of an inch thick. So the common solution is to use 9/16 inch thick stock to make your panel. Or you can cut a rabbet around the back of the panel so the panel can then sit back inside the frame. For this jig to work properly, you have to choose one of those two options. And for me, the simplest option is to just cut a rabbet, reducing the thickness of the panel, just around its edges, to 9/16 of an inch. So here's how to do that. First, I have to know how thick my panel actually is, because it may not be exactly 3/4 of an inch. A digital caliper is a great way to get an accurate measurement, and sure enough, my stock measures a bit less than 3/4 at 0.647. Now I want to reduce that to 9/16, which according to the scale on the back of my caliper is 0.562. So subtract 0.562 from 0.647 and I get 0.085. That's how much I need to remove from the panel's thickness, so that's the height to which I set my router bit above the table. This jig is also designed to leave a 1/2 inch wide tongue around the edge of the panel to fit into the grooves in your frame. So I set my fence to expose a 1/2 inch of the bit and I'm ready to back cut my panel. I always cut the end grain first, where tear out's most likely to occur. Then I can clean up that tear out when I make the rest of my cuts along the grain. These rabbets created the back cut I needed to reduce the panel's thickness to 9/16 of an inch just around its edges. But the tongue itself that will fit inside the grooves in the frame has to be a 1/4 inch thick. So I have to take some more material, this time off the front of the panel. 9/16 minus a 1/4 equals 5/16 or 0.312. So I set my bit to that new height without moving the fence, and then I can cut another set of rabbets, this time on the front of the panel. That creates a 1/4 inch thick tongue all the way around. What remains is a thick raised center, or a raised panel. But to make it more attractive, we want to bevel the edges of the raised center. And we can do that with the same straight router bit and our new jig. I install my jig against the fence so my router bit just barely brushes against the rim of the hole in the center. I don't want to cut into the jig, I just want it as close as possible. I lay the panel on top of the jig with the front side downward, and now I have to use some trial and error to set my bit height. I want the corner of the bit to just scrape against the tongue on the edge of the panel. Unfortunately, the adjustment mechanism for a lot of router lifts is beneath the jig, so I have to keep moving the jig out of the way to change the bit's height. I considered cutting another hole in the jig's base so I can access the lift control through it, but once I get this dialed in, I just measure the bit's final height and then write it down, and I won't have to go through this trial and error next time. With the bit height set, I clamp the jig to the fence and I put a little wax on the parts of the jig that the panel slides against for smoother operation. Then I make my first cut, being sure to keep the panel flat on top of the jig as I pass it over the bit. If you end up with a little shelf on the edge of your panel, you need to raise your bit a little bit more. A properly set bit should create a bevel that meets the tongue as perfectly and smoothly as possible. Mine here left a shallow line in the tongue. That's likely to sand away easily, so I'm not that worried about it, but if it were any deeper, I'd lower the router bit a tiny bit to get a smooth transition. As you cut the bevels around the perimeter of the panel, remember to do the end grain first, then the long grain to clean up any potential tear out. If you have several raised panels to make, do them all now before you adjust the jig to widen the bevel with the second pass. Yes, depending on the width of your router bit, one pass will not be enough to do the full bevel. So move your router table fence and the attached jig away from the bit and take another pass all the way around the panel to widen the bevel. As you do, the center of the panel will stand above the bevel a bit less. I like that rise to be about 1/16 of an inch in the center. Once that's dialed in, finish up all your raised panels in your project before you put your jig away. If your router bit was sharp, there should be little to no tear out, but a little sanding may be required to crisp up the edges of the end grain. I'm using a carbide sanding block here, but some adhesive-backed sandpaper on a scrap of wood will work too. In fact, you can make a custom block that's exactly as wide as the bevel for sanding those surfaces smooth as well. I know I threw a lot of numbers at you in this video, but it's not complicated at all. Those same settings also apply every time you use this jig after you set it up the first time, no matter what the size of the panel is. So write them down on the bottom of the jig itself, and they'll be handy for next time. I even made a diagram laying out the measurements of the bevels and tongues as they would be in the completed panel, because again, this jig is always going to cut them the same, no matter the overall size of the panel itself. By the way, my bit height for cutting my bevels ended up being 0.754 above the top of the router table, not the top of the jig. So that could save you most of your trial and error anyway. Don't forget to use the link below this video to get plans for the jig. It's really an easy way to make a classic raised panel with simple, straight router bit. Now here's another good idea for your shop. This is obviously not something that they invented, but they made it more affordable, significantly so. And that's a good thing, because this will make your table saw safer to use. On the bottom are grippy pads to control both halves of a workpiece throughout the cutting process, while the angled handle on top encourages pressure against the fence and down on the table at the same time. Now this greatly reduces the chance that an offcut will turn and bind between the blade and the fence, which is a major cause of kickback and amputations. The body of the jig also bridges over the top of the saw blade, protecting your hand should something go wrong if you don't have a blade guard installed. You can even use two of them together to walk longer rips through the blade for a more fluid, smoother feed with maximum control and protection. Because every situation is different, the Grabber Pro is adjustable. You can change the configuration of the soles to cut strips as narrow as 1/8 of an inch without cutting into the block. If you want extra stability for narrow workpieces, you can lower the support foot on the side. And there's a removable, replaceable sacrificial heel catch on the back for even more pushing power. I make as many cuts as possible with my table saw's blade guard in place. But when you do have to remove the guard, or if your saw doesn't have a guard, this is a significant safety upgrade in my opinion. And it can be used on the router table, on the jointer, even on the bandsaw, so you're going to get a lot of use from your investment. As I said, it's significantly less expensive than the other version on the market, yet the build quality is excellent. And the Grabber Pro comes with both 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch thin strip attachments right out of the box. And when you consider that, I think it comes in at almost half the price. So do yourself a favor and use the link below this video to check it out for yourself.